Morning, Mr. Campbell.
Morning, sir.
Ms. Clare.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to ask you about what your views were on the 3rd of May about separating the officers when they went to the canteen. Now, we've heard some evidence already from Conrad Trickett about what the post-incident procedure SOP says, and we've heard some comments from Colin Robson about his views, and he talked in his inquiry statement about you pressuring him on that, and then in evidence he said you were pressure testing his views. I'm interested in what your views were.
Yeah, so on the 3rd of May, when I was instructed to become SIO around about 08:30 or 08:15 hours on the 3rd of May, initial consultation with Colin Robson at that time via telephone call prior to leaving Livingston office was around a number of different initial priorities. One of the discussions I had with Colin then, and I believe when I was driving through to Kirkcaldy, was round about discussing with him the location of the officers, status of the officers, and it was a discussion with two investigators, experienced investigators, and it was really, I heard Colin's evidence round about, I think he indicated he felt under pressure around it, but it wasn't that. It was a consideration, and although the SOP quite clearly states, and the SOP obviously we were utilising that time was the PIP for armed policing under the APP, so it was being flexible with that SOP through the work of Conrad. So I didn't really have any great issue if I had to separate the officers at that time, so that was a consideration. But again, thereafter, what I was trying to was balance the status of the officers, the location of the officers, where they are at that time, how long they already had been together. So at 08:30 hours, they already had been together 1 hour on the instruction of Inspector K to move from the locus back to the canteen, which Inspector K did with the best of intentions. So again, there was a number of points which I was kind of playing out in my head around the best way forward with this, and I discussed it with Leslie Bowell at that time as well. So it was serious consideration round about the necessity to separate them. Was it safe to do so? What was the condition of the officers? Was it practical based on the accommodation within Kirkcaldy office? And was it necessary? So again, the necessity aspect was really important round about the fact was the officers at that stage and through the duration of the 3rd of May were witnesses. So again, to separate witnesses, why were we doing that? So again, the other aspect of looking at were they involved or suspected of any criminality at that time? No, they weren't. Were they suspected of any misconduct at that time? No, they weren't. Would we have been able to, or would we be able to manage the officers within the canteen, within what became the PIM suite, with putting in suitable control measures around that? And what I mean is putting in individuals who could ensure that there was non-conferral with the officers involved in the incident within the canteen area. So again, that was all playing out. As I said, discussions with Leslie, with Colin around my thought process around that, and the requirement to separate, which ultimately did not materialise because I didn't believe there was a necessity to separate them. Their status was that of witnesses. What the direction and the decision I made was in line with the standard operating procedure in place in 2015 and is still in place today around that. So again, it was that balance with the welfare and the well-being of the officers, but also ensuring that we could get the benefits for the investigation as well at that time. So it wasn't just a quick flippant decision I made not to separate them. There was a lot of thought went into the reason why I didn't eventually separate them. And again, if my decision has changed through the course of my journey to Kirkcaldy Police Office, and I had decided once I arrived that I would separate them, I simply would have done that. I wouldn't have hesitated with that if the rationale behind my thinking at that time had changed. I would simply have separated them, but it didn't. And as I say, I was more than happy with the decision I made around that.
From the perspective purely of SIO,
Yes.
and from the investigation, what would the advantages to you have been of separating the officers?
The aspect is collaboration of the witnesses, or the potential aspect of collaboration, and discussing the incident prior to you getting that initial perception of the officers in a statement form or a personal initial account of what actually had occurred. So again, there is that aspect of the fact, would there be benefit as an SIO to separate at that time? And again, you're thereafter balancing it with some of the other aspects I looked at. Was it safe to do so? Was it practical? Was it necessary? What would be the perception of the officers if I had to separate them, put them in individual rooms and put uniformed officers standing by them almost to manage them? What perception would that play out about their welfare and well-being? So it was that balance. Could, as SIO, what I was looking to achieve through the fact that their evidence or their statements would be sterile as such, could that be achieved by putting in place suitable control measures within the canteen area?
When you use the word sterile, what do you mean?
I think just the best evidence. That their evidence is not contaminated in any way. What we have is a true recollection of what actually occurred, and it's not in any way tainted by collaboration with other officers who were at the scene as such.
In collaboration, you mean, we've heard the word conferral
Yes.
used, you used the word tainted, so no influence on their recollection from the recollection of others.
Yes.
And you talk about their perception. Was that a significant factor in weighing up the different options open to you?
No, that was solely a decision by myself. Looking at that independently, not involved in the actual incident, coming in from out with the area to lead on the investigation. So there was no pressure on me to have the officers separated or have the officers remain together within the canteen. That was solely a decision I made as SIO.
Right. And you twice used the word safe. What did you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that, and it was clear when I addressed them, that they were extremely traumatised by what had occurred, more so when they obviously were aware that Mr. Bio had passed away, I was deceased. So, and what I was aware at the time, after I addressed the officers, was that there was officers from 6-7 months police service that were actually probationers that were there, as well as officers maybe with 27-28 years service. So there was that whole dynamic spread of experience of officers and what they were going through at that time. So that aspect of welfare and well-being was paramount as well, round about the fact to put an individual within a separate part of the building, almost with some sort of control measure in place, such as an officer sitting with that individual. How would that impact on their welfare, well-being, their mental health at that particular time? Whereby it's quite clear the standard operating procedure is not to separate, and still is today.
In the initial stages, you've talked about the journey to Kirkcaldy and keeping an open mind about the different hypotheses. Yep. Did you initially want to separate the officers?
No, as I say, it was a consideration, but as I say, the number of different... That was only one pillar of the investigation that I was considering during that 45-minute journey to Kirkcaldy. So
if Colin Robson formed that impression,
yep.
What would you say about that?
So to me it was simply a discussion with myself as SIO leading the investigation, but Colin as that on-call detective inspector who had a better grip at that time, a better understanding of the environment, the landscape that the officers were in at that stage and where they were in the journey and what had happened at that point. So although I was getting briefed by Colin, I just wanted to get a more in-depth understanding exactly what we had prior to my arrival at Kirkcaldy office.
Can I move on and ask you told us last week about going into the canteen and talking to the officers.
Yeah.
And you also told us that you wanted the equipment, the police officers' clothing and equipment to be recovered.
Yeah.
I think you had mentioned that to the officers.
Yeah.
I think you gave evidence about that last week. Could you tell us about your discussion with Conrad Trickett in relation to recovery of the clothing?
It was very quick. As I say, I was going to brief the officers at the time, and I was just explaining to Colin that we would be looking to, with their consent, seize their external clothing, footwear and their officer safety equipment. However, that would be done under sterile conditions. I'd already arranged for DCI Stuart Houston to come over and manage the various scenes at that time, and also the scene being the officers involved in the recovery of their equipment. So as I say, it was a very quick discussion with Colin, what I was expecting and what I was going to speak to the officers around.
Sorry, was that a conversation with Colin Robson?
No, Conrad, sorry.
Conrad.
Yeah, sorry.
And then you looked at the 11:30 Gold Group minutes last week and noted that forensic recovery of equipment was noted at that meeting.
Yes.
And then we've heard evidence from Conrad Trickett that he'd noted in his PIM log that around 3:30 in the afternoon he'd discussed the length of time about recovery of clothing was taking.
Yeah.
And he discussed that with you. Do you remember him raising that with you?
Yeah, it was a very brief discussion again. I think it was in the corridor outside one of the rooms. And there were a number of reasons around why that was taking quite an extended period of time.
Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so basically Stuart Houston arrived around about midday or thereabouts and was given the task by myself, delegated to him, to take control of all the scenes as we previously discussed, with one of the scenes being the canteen and the officers within there, and round about how we could ensure that was done under sterile conditions. So that thereafter moved on to Stuart developing the forensic strategy document, which we've already discussed, and thereafter the arrival of PIRC around about 1:30 that day. Myself, Stuart, Colin, one or two others went into a briefing around about 1:45 with them before the goal group, the second goal group, whereby again the investigative priorities were discussed with DSI Keith Harwood from PIRC and his team. We went into the goal group after that, and the forensic strategy document was finalised just after the second goal group. And we went into the forensic strategy briefing with PIRC around about 16:45 hours, and at that stage that was signed off by PIRC and by myself, and we agreed the priorities around that. So it did take a bit of time that afternoon, mainly because we were dealing with multiple scenes. We were also awaiting the arrival of PIRC and to discuss with them if they agreed with our priorities and how we were actually going to decant the equipment from the officers under sterile conditions using independent police officers that are not from the division but from the major investigation team, and also ensuring that we had a force medical examiner there as well to check on their welfare and well-being prior to basically being released at that stage or prior to getting off duty. So that was all. It just took a bit of time to basically to manage that.
Why was it not possible to recover the equipment at an earlier stage?
It was mainly a systematic, structured approach. I agreed with Stuart Houston that we would do it under sterile conditions. We would do it to ensure their privacy as well. We would do it independently from the group, so we'd bring one in at a time to do that and manage it. Explain to them in detail why we were doing it, so that they had no doubts around about the reasons for it, and that it wasn't officers that had already been involved in the investigation, so we brought major investigation team officers in to manage the recovery of some of the individual's property at that time.
And that all took time?
It did take time, yes.
And were you able to secure the services of independent police officers?
We had major investigation team officers came in for it, but we still had to use 1 or 2 officers from the neighbouring divisions that had come in to assist the investigation at an early stage.
What were the neighbouring divisions?
So it would be C Division, which is Central Scotland. It would be E Division, which would be Edinburgh. It would be J Division, which is Lothian and the Borders.
Right. Looking back, you've spoken about being in the canteen with the officers. We've heard a number of witnesses give evidence that equipment was lying around, some of it was leaning against walls or on the floor, and we've heard about a table in the canteen which had equipment on it from different officers. Looking back now, do you have any concerns about the forensic integrity? And you've mentioned the word sterile, and I'm wondering if you had any concerns.
No, so I mean, the time I arrived at 9 o'clock, the equipment had already been taken. They'd taken off their body armour and their equipment. My recollection of it within the canteen, it was the majority was kind of placed against a wall within the canteen area. I can't recall any being on the table you're describing. I think Conrad indicated I sat down, but I didn't. I actually just stood up and briefed the officers because it was very, very quick. I was getting into the goal group at that time. So did we lose anything regarding evidential capture? I'm not sure we did. They were aware we were going to basically seize the property. The aspect of any cross-contamination had already happened at that particular stage. They had been together for a particular length of time. They had been together at the locus. At Hayfield Road. They had obviously an instruction Inspector K decanted back into the canteen area where they had been together again. And it was more important from my perspective, as well as through the work that Stuart Houston done at that time, that what we did do thereafter was ensure the integrity once we took involvement in it, to basically ensure that the crime scene or the scene examination of the individual officers was done as best as possible.
At any time during that day, did anyone draw to your attention a matter regarding Nicole Short's vest?
No.
Can I ask you about the CS and Pava sprays, which we've heard had been discharged at the scene?
Yes.
And what involvement, if any, did you have in determining the strategy for recovery of those?
It was again just with discussion with Stuart Houston prior to discussing it with the PIRC round about how we would manage that. And again, Stuart had done some research and discussed it with various individuals, I'm not sure who, but round about how we would seize it, about how we would wait to detail exactly what had been, if it had been discharged or if there had been any loss from the PAVA or CS. And thereafter we would appropriately package that to ensure that there would be no aspect of any evidential loss at that time. But again, that whole aspect was delegated through to Stuart Houston around the whole management of that.
Did you have any involvement in discussing the packaging or the weighing of
No.
the sprays? And were you advised whether the sprays had been properly recovered or packaged?
No.
Right. Have you anything written in your daybook or your policy file that would help us understand what was happening regarding recovery of equipment, or is it simply the forensic recovery strategy?
It's the forensic strategy, the document, yes, and the minutes.
And the minutes. And anything else in your daybook that you want to draw to our attention? That you remember we looked at this last week.
Yeah.
It's PS 18269. And we looked primarily at pages 4 and 5 last week. We can see page 4 on the screen.
think, I don't know if you go to the next page, which starts up the top, Birney, in the right-hand one.
Right, page 5, right-hand side.
Again,
That
just, I think it's the one on from that.
Oh, right, sorry, that'll be page 6, I think.
Yeah, so
Yes,
if you go down
right-hand
to number 4, officers' clothing, sterile environment, crime scenes, scene management.
And what does it say under that?
Injuries noted. So that was the FME aspect of it we were discussing, that we didn't note any injuries.
So when was this written?
So I think this was written either prior to the goal group number 2 or during the goal group number 2. I think it was prior to, I think it was maybe at the meeting with the PIRC.
So we've heard that was a gold group meeting at 14:40,
Yeah.
and that was the first one that PERC attended.
It was, but there was, we had a meeting before that, and I think it's documented in Colin Robson's book at 14:05 and the PIRC investigator Maguire's book at 14:10. There was a meeting prior to the goal group with myself and Keith Harrow and our teams.
You spoke about that last week.
Which thereafter led right into that goal group. So I think this is potentially, I think this is what I've noted at that time around some of the priorities.
Thank you. We were looking at the gold group minutes last week for the first gold group meeting, 11:30, PS 06491. Do you remember we discussed this?
Yes, I do.
Can I ask you about agenda item 9, please? And it says resources, DCS Bowl, CI Shepherd. And I'm interested in this agenda item. Tell us about the connection between DCS Bowl and resources, please.
So it looks as if that's been the more wider aspect of divisional resources within that particular division at the time, because of the impact of the number of loci that we had at that stage, and we were standing officers by that. So all uniform officers that were usually involved in the patrols within that area were tied up, basically standing by various locations. So it looks as if that's the kind of local staffing issues have been discussed, and I know that was looked at kind of wider by Gary McEwen around looking at mutual aid coming in from various divisions and surrounding Fife to assist over not just that day, but it was going to take a number of days to run through this. And the high-vis reassurance patrols is your normal kind of community impact after a critical incident, just that high visibility officers on the street.
What was DCS Bowl's role in relation to resources?
I'm not sure exactly why. It would really be Chief Inspector Shepherd and Gary McEwen it would have that. I don't know if Leslie's maybe just updated round about some aspect to that, but it wouldn't really sit with Leslie, to be honest with you.
All right, thank you. Agenda item 11, Media Strategy Communications Plan. This was a matter for Kate Finlay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, did you have any knowledge about how an allegation about an officer being stabbed had got into the public domain?
So my recollection, my knowledge of that is that on driving through to Kirkcaldy, it was on, I think it was Radio 4th, I'm not sure, one of the radio channels, and the information came that it was broadcast that an incident had occurred in Kirkcaldy and an officer had been stabbed, and I knew at that time from my discussions with Colin that was wholly inaccurate. So I contacted the on-call comms Spock, which was Kate Finlay, and asked her to ensure that was withdrawn immediately because of the inaccuracy of it. So Kate had informed me that it hadn't came internally from police, that had came from an external source.
What does that mean?
So it hadn't came, we hadn't self-generated that media release, it hadn't came internally, so it had came externally from elsewhere. But it certainly had been broadcast that an officer had been stabbed, and as I say, I can actually recall I was driving over the Forth Road Bridge at the time when I actually heard it. But as I say, I asked her to withdraw it immediately because I knew it was inaccurate.
And how did you know it was inaccurate?
because I had discussed through the course of the last 40 minutes with Colin Robson round about what had occurred.
Okay. And when you say internally and externally, when you refer to internally, what do you mean?
So the police generally, particularly for serious incidents or major incidents, we would proactively move towards a media release of some sort. At the early stages of any investigation, we would produce what's called an if asked normally, which is an if asked statement. If the media ask us for comment, it would usually be run by myself as SIO, saying was I happy with this going out to media, or if we wanted to be more proactive with anything at all at that stage, again through discussion with the SIO and the comms lead, we would pull together a draft statement to be released to the media proactively, either through a witness appeal or for community reassurance as such, or both.
So internal would be an official media statement,
Yes.
or a fast media statement being prepared by Police Scotland,
Okay.
rather than an individual officer.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to look at some other minutes, please? PS 06492, and these are the 1440 Gold Group meeting minutes, which was the second Gold Group meeting on the 3rd of May. And again, we see that you were present at this, and as we've said before, Keith Harrower from PERC and Keith Hardy from MIT were present for the first time. Tell us what difference it made that PERC were present at this meeting.
I mean, it was critical. I mean, they were the lead investigating authority, so they had to be there. You know what I mean? It would have been extremely beneficial for them to be at the first Gold Group at 11:30. But it was critical we had them at that table for that Gold Group, as I say, as being the lead investigating authority.
Why would it have been beneficial for them to have been at the first meeting?
Mainly due to the fact that they were the lead authority. You know, I mean, they were a lead authority from my understanding, I've been informed at 09:35 hours by PSD, by Craig Blackhall, that they had been allocated ownership of the investigation. So, and due to the fact, as I've indicated before, the investigation was moving at such fast pace, and I was keeping Keith Harrower updated via telephone when about some of the actions that were being progressed and what we had established. However, that is just simply the investigation side. I'm speaking to Keith around the whole holistic aspect of the management of a critical incident and a significant investigation, until you basically sit at a Gold Group and you get that kind of wider spectrum of exactly what's occurred and what really some of the challenges may be. You don't really get that just through the kind of single lens of looking through the investigation, if that makes sense.
All right. And then if we look at item 3, which is on page 2, do we see at this stage that DCI Houston is identified at this point as crime scene coordinator? You talked about that last
Yes.
week. He was actually at this meeting as well,
Yes.
wasn't he? So he'd arrived at Kirkcaldy by this time. And then it says witness strategy, just 3 bullet points down from that. MIP to be deployed to note statements from significant witnesses. Update MIT to progress with investigation. Ongoing discussions re-witness strategy to be discussed with PERC. Discussion re-seizure of production from police witnesses. Can you tell us about this element of the discussion?
Yeah, so in the main, that was round about any of the significant identified witnesses that became apparent, and a lot of this was down to some of the house-to-house and door-to-door parameters that we had set at that time, and I think I discussed it last week round about if we did come across through general house-to-house that the PIRC wanted the option to basically deploy their own resources to some of the more significant eyewitnesses if they became apparent. The MIT coming on board, again, we had a number of MIT officers arriving through the course of from 10, 11 o'clock right through till the Gold Group here. So again, having experienced investigators from the major investigation team who were used to the protocols for a major investigation of a major crime or incident as such, was really beneficial. So it was about how we best utilise MIT resources in line with the PIC and looking at that response.
And further down, you see just at the what was the bottom of the page, seizure of productions from officers being carried out today. Staff have been advised by Federation staff not to provide any statements. Now, you gave evidence last week about your understanding of the position regarding Amanda Given's evidence and the Federation advice. At the time of this Gold Group meeting, did that remain your understanding of the position regarding the officers and the provision of statements?
Yes, that really didn't change at all through the course of the 3rd of May. That was the advice coming from Amanda Given.
And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then further down, we can start to see next of kin strategy. Partner of deceased made aware and statement noted. No formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Can I ask you about that, please? The use of a Facebook image and whether you have any concerns about that at that stage in the day.
So that was carried out without my knowledge, and it was under the direction of Colin Robson. This was the initial discussion with Colette Bell, who provided a number of images of the deceased. We also had a further image through the interrogation of police systems that we could utilise as well. So again, it was having as best as possible the confidence that the individual at the Victoria Hospital was Mr. Bio. So again, it's more informal identification, but to have that confidence prior to visiting the next of kin that you're almost nearly 100% confident without formal identification that this is the individual you're basically explaining to the family that has sadly passed away.
There may be concerns that using a Facebook image is a particularly informal method, and there are better methods available to officers. If you had been involved in this aspect, what would you have preferred to do?
I mean, historically, it's best done if we can by images that we hold on our police systems as such, if we can, if the individual has been involved with the police previously. Again, with the significant use of social media these days, I mean, a lot of the times the best imagery is within some social media sites around the individuals concerned. So although I wasn't involved and authorised this aspect of it, I can see why it was done. It was done with the best of intention to identify as quickly as possible who the individual there was at the hospital. That was Mr. Bio. So again, that doesn't. I mean, there's not hard and fast rules around that. As an SIO, I would look at all options around about identification. I mean, the priority is to try to identify as soon as possible. And again, there are a number of options now, probably more options open now than there were 20 years ago, just because of the abundance of individuals now on social media sites. But again, it really is just that informal aspect to have and to provide the police with some sort of confidence that the information we are given is accurate.
And looking back now, do you have any concerns about the death message being relayed to Colette Bell prior to any form of identification having been carried out?
I don't, and I say that having considered the reasons why we did do that. It became clear from, after speaking, the death message had already been delivered to Colette before I was made aware of it, but from discussion with Colin Robson, who had obviously was liaising with the two officers who were dealing with Colette, was that it was very clear to Colette at that time through the discussion that she highly suspected that the person within the hospital who was deceased was a partner. And just with the information passed, Colin's decision at that time was he thought it was a competent decision to deliver that message to Colette as the partner of the deceased, with the information she had passed and the fact that she was highly aware that it was her partner that was deceased. So it's not something we normally do. It's something that we would probably more likely go to the confirm next of kin initially around that. However, I can see why Colin made the decision to deliver the message to Colette at the time. It was basically done transparently, honestly. It was done because the fact is that she had a great understanding that, from not just from what we told her, but from the information she had from Mr. Zaid, and just she was putting two and two together at that particular stage. I think it would have been silly not to basically make her aware of it, to be honest. And as I say, it was done with the best of intentions, and to be kind of honest and transparent with Colette around that.
And then this bullet point in the minutes goes on to say, next of kin identified as sister and an FLO being identified. 2 Police Scotland FLOs have been identified. 1 DI is FLO to brief and coordinate. Can you tell us what this part of the discussion was about?
Yeah, so this was the issues we had, as I said previously, around about identification of the 2 family liaison officers, the issues with the storm scope system that we believed that these people were on duty. We contacted one of the DIs, I think it was within the MIT, who was tasked thereafter to try to bring family liaison officers out as soon as possible, and that's the role that individual did, was identify Kevin Hoolison and one other who attended thereafter within a relatively short period of time. But as again, I've already highlighted some of the challenges we had when about the family liaison side of things.
Thank you. The final page, I don't need to take you to it, refers to the PERC looking for a definitive point of contact. That's agenda item 12, which is on the final page. We've heard evidence from you that you were a point of contact effectively for Keith Harrower on the 3rd of May.
Yeah.
What does it mean that PERC were looking for a definitive point of contact with knowledge of all circumstances? If we come up to
could see that.
agenda item 12. Oh, you see the second line under any other business. PERC looking for definitive point of contact with knowledge of all circumstances.
So the point of contact for the investigation was myself. I think what that potentially is looking at is we're looking for a single point of contact. It looks as if potentially sitting under Gary McEwen in respect to the wider aspect of the community impact involvement around that. That's the only thing I can think of. It was quite clear. I mean, that myself and Keith were aware that I was a single point of contact for the investigation. I think it's a wider aspect of the critical incident. He was looking for a point of contact, and I don't know if that was maybe given to Chief Inspector Nicky Shepherd at that time.
Right, there are prior entries in relation to the community impact. Maybe we should look at those as well. If we can go back a page, we have items 6 and 7, which talk about community issues and community impact assessment review. Does that assist you?
Yeah, I think that's the only thing I can think of around that, because it was clear, I mean, from early discussion with Keith at 10:20, that I was the investigative lead for Police Scotland for this, so that was clear, and Keith said as well. I think it's the wider aspect of the various other pillars of the the incident that Keith was maybe looking for a point of contact with, other than speaking to someone who's dealing with community impact, speaking to someone who's dealing with the equality diversity side, speaking to someone who's dealing with the media. I think he was maybe looking for a point of contact who could almost generalise and provide that kind of update.
Last week, I think on your first day, you talked about the investigation and you being bronze command of that, but there being other bronze commanders within that structure, which dealt with different issues, community impact and media and that type of thing. So do you think the point of contact related to the other columns within that structure?
I think that's what it does.
Thank you. Can I ask you about delivery of the death message or death messages to the Johnstons, who were, Caddy Johnston was Mr. Byles' next of kin. What was your involvement in the delivery of those messages. So that we've heard this was roughly around 3:10 in the afternoon. Mitchell and Parker attended to deliver the first death message.
Yeah, so I think I detailed last week around the challenges with the family liaison officers being identified that were suitably trained, and thereafter about the discussion with myself and Leslie Bowl that we couldn't delay any further at that stage, and we deployed two police officers or detectives that were involved in the investigation. So that information, I think it was about 2:30 or thereabouts, we asked the Parker through Colin Robson to basically attend and deliver the death message to the family and provide information that family liaison officers would be deployed as soon as possible to provide further information at that time around that. And thereafter, we had the aspect of the death message being delivered to the family around about, I think it was about 3 o'clock, my understanding. But thereafter, the information coming back via Graham Dursley and thereafter into Colin Robson that there had been a number of significant questions asked by the family, quite rightly so, around it, and they had asked if was there any further information that we could provide at that stage.
Could I ask you about the first death message?
Yes.
We've heard evidence from Mitchell and Parker and Dursley and Robson about this. What involvement did you have in deciding what to tell the Johnsons?
So the information we asked to inform them was the information that we'd given to Colette Bell at the time, so there was that consistent message with it. So that was the reason we identified Parker and his colleague at that time as well, Mitchell, to deliver that. So it was a consistent message that was being delivered. By
this time, you were aware that the Facebook identification had been carried out. In relation to the information which was being given to Caddy Johnson at that first occasion by Mitchell and Parker, we heard that there wasn't really much change between the message that had been given to Colette Bell. Did you reflect on whether more information should be given to Caddy Johnson?
Yeah, so it's really challenging because it does look extremely cold, and the fact that we're holding information back, and I've experienced this over a number of years in a number of investigations. Ultimately, we can only deliver information that we have at that particular time, that we're confident that we have. So again, what we do deliver and what information we do give is what there is no doubt that is accurate and 100%. We're confident that the rationale behind it and the information we have can be verified as such. So again, it does look extremely cold. It does look very, very narrow, the information we give. However, it is what information we know at that particular time. And at that stage, we'll obviously still have a number of different hypotheses we're running through regarding the investigation at that time as well. So again, there are reasons why maybe we wouldn't elaborate on particular strands or particular areas at that point. So again, the priority is just to deliver the message, to make them aware at that stage, and thereafter what we're looking at is putting the family liaison officers, trained family liaison officers in directly after that to begin to engage and thereafter start to feed in some of the other information that we had through the course of that later afternoon and early evening.
Were you part of a discussion in relation to that first death message that went to Caddy Johnson?
So I believe, yeah.
Tell us about that discussion that you had and who was it with?
Yeah, so that discussion was through myself and Leslie Bowl, deciding that we couldn't wait any longer. Keith Harrow was made aware as well, and he agreed that we just deploy as soon as reasonably practical to the family. And again, relayed that through to Colin Robson, and I think Colin spoke to Dursley around it at that time. We had agreed, myself and Leslie, that the two officers who delivered the original message to Colette would be utilised, and the information was we would pass the same message at that time. However, with the additional information that family liaison officers would be deployed very shortly to provide you with some further information.
We've heard that the first death message that was delivered by Mitchell and Parker contained no information that Mr. Bio had died after police contact, after coming into contact with officers at Hayfield Road. Why was that information withheld from Caddy Johnson?
So I'm not sure 100% of the wording of that first message. All we did ask was the same message that was delivered to Colette at that time went out to the family. So again, I had left that with Colin Robson to manage that aspect of it, that there was that consistent message across both what was delivered to Colette and what was delivered to the next of kin in the family.
Is it of concern to you that that information was withheld from Caddy Johnson?
So the more extended second message detailed in far more detail round about that contact and that aspect of.
I'll come on to that in a moment. Looking back now, is it of concern to you that information was withheld from Caddy Johnson about Mr. Bio having died after police contact?
So if we had that, the intention was to deploy family liaison officers at that time with a more extensive update that we could provide to them. However, because of the delay with that, we had to deliver because the passage of time. The understanding intention for myself and Leslie was simply to deliver the death message, and thereafter we would basically provide further information a short time later by the deployment of family liaison officers. So we were aware of the fact that the officers involved in delivering the message weren't family liaison trained, and there was going to be potential conflict or with the family, with Police Scotland at that time. So again, could we have provided further information at that stage? Possibly. As I say, what we did do was look at what further information within the space of within 15-20 minutes, what else we could provide to them, and that was thereafter the statement which I thereafter drafted and gave to Dursley to deliver.
I'll come on to that. Why was Caddy Johnson not told when the first death message was relayed that Mr. Bio had died after contact with the police?
So generally I'm not sure. I wasn't involved in the exact wording of that. It was simply there was an urgency to deliver a death message to the family, and that was what was delivered by Parker and Mitchell at that time.
If you had been aware that the intention was not to mention that he'd died after coming into contact with the police, what would your view have been about that?
Sorry, could you
Would you have been concerned in any way if you had been aware that when they were delivering the first death message to the Johnsons, they intended not to share with Caddy Johnson that Mr. Bio had died after coming into contact with the police?
I think they had limited information at a particular stage as well. So they were simply being asked to deliver what had been delivered to Colette Bell. So I wouldn't put the blame on the particular officers. I think with hindsight, could we have delivered a more extended form of words to the family, such as a second death message at that initial stage? Yeah, we probably could have. As I say, it was mainly due to the fact we were looking to inform the family as soon as possible because of the delay, which there is absolutely no doubt that could have been done far more quicker than it was that particular stage. And as I say, there was issues with the deployment of flows on the 3rd of May, but yeah, no, I mean it could have been.
From an SIO perspective, from the perspective of the senior investigating officer, was there any reason at the time the first death message was delivered to Caddy Johnson, so roughly about 3:10 in the afternoon, so from your perspective at that time, was there any reason not to share with Caddy Johnson that Mr. Bio had died after coming into contact with police?
No, and as you'll be aware, the second death message was delivered very, very quickly after that, so we could easily have... I think what we had at the time was we'd identified an urgency to deliver a death message to the family and the next of kin, with the understanding that we were going to deploy family liaison within that 30 minutes, half an hour or so, who would provide a more extended version of exactly what had occurred. So, with hindsight, could we have delivered that second death message, a more thorough death message, which again, there were still significant questions being asked of the officers when they delivered that message, quite rightly so as well. But that probably did provide a more thorough update regarding the status of the investigation and where we were with it at that time.
So at that time, no reason from the point of view of the investigation?
No.
Or protecting the investigation that would result in withholding that information? From your perspective as SIO, was there any other reason why that information would be withheld from Caddy Johnson?
The information we had at the time, a great deal of that was in the public domain, I would imagine, at that time anyway. It was within the community that there had been an incident involving the police and the deceased, so the information we provided could have been provided at the first instance. There was no reason as SIO from an investigative perspective why I would have held back on that.
Now, we discussed last week that the initial terms of reference in the Gold Group included a reference to the reputation of the police. And I asked you questions about that last week. And you may appreciate that there was concern that this was perhaps withheld, this information, with some intention to protect the reputation of Police Scotland. Do you have any comment about that?
I think sharing the information with the family probably enhances the reputation of Police Scotland, that we've been open and transparent. So there's two sides to that whole reputation side of things, as well as maybe don't want that in the public domain just now, but there was no reason why we couldn't put that to the family in particular. So again, I think it would enhance the aspect of the reputation at that particular time.
Why would you not want that information being in the public domain if it enhances the transparency and perhaps trust of the family to know that? Why would it not equally enhance transparency and trust in the public for them to know that? Yeah,
it would, and that's why the second death message was delivered within 20 minutes, detailing exactly what's in that death message, which was what we knew at that time.
And can you, well, let's move on to that second death message. Can you explain why it was delivered in two visits by Mitchell and Parker rather than simply one?
So the issue with the first death message is, in hindsight, we should have elaborated more on what we knew at that particular time to the next of kin. The feedback we got from through Dursley into Colin Robson into myself was that was there additional information that we could provide the family at that time in respect of answering some of the questions that were being asked. So again, at that time, a discussion myself, Leslie Bowl, Keith Harrower was round about, well, what exactly do we know just now and what can we provide? And again, the three of us sat at a table and I drafted out a form of words around that with inputs from Keith and one from Leslie Bowl in respect to that.
So that was the second death message was drafted with Keith Harrower from Perk.
Yes.
DC Superintendent Leslie Bowl
yes.
and yourself.
Yes.
We heard evidence from DS Dursley that he'd come up and spoken to, I think, you about do you remember that?
No, I don't. What I do recall, I think the Gold Group was ongoing at the time, the second Gold Group, and I think Dursley had came to the door. I think Colin Robson was in the Gold Group and had went outside and came back in and or made me aware that there was an issue, and I either went outside or went to a corner of the room and discussed with Colin around it. I think that's how it materialised. And thereafter I discussed it. I don't know if it was at the end of the meeting or we went outside or went to a different part of that room and just identified that there was an issue with the information that had been provided to the family at that time. if I feel we stepped outside myself and Leslie and Keith and managed that, or managed it in another part of that area, because it was during that period of the goal group that started at 14:40, so that was running at the time that this occurred. But I can recall Dursley coming to the door or intimating to Colin Robson to come outside at the time around that.
Right. Can we have a look at PS 05793, which should be a handwritten note? We've heard from DS Dursley that this was effectively the second death message. Do you recognise that handwritten?
I do, yes.
Whose writing's that?
So the writing, with the exception of the words Sheikh and Islam, is my writing.
Right. And this is the second death message that was delivered to the
Yes.
Johnsons that day. Who wrote Sheikh Islam?
I'm not sure. I've never actually seen that, to be honest with you.
Right. And we can do you want to read out your?
Yeah, so following
handwriting.
an incident this morning in the Hayfield Road area of Kirkcaldy, officers from Police Scotland have been attempting to arrest Sheikh Bayo, during which time he has become unconscious, conveyed to hospital by the Scottish Ambulance Service, and despite the best efforts by medical staff, died shortly after 9 a.m. this morning.
And that was the combined efforts of the three of you.
I think that's maybe Leslie's notation at the top. I'm just looking, she's changed the word. I think I've handed it to her, and if you maybe just go back up to the top of that again.
Yes.
There's see where I don't think she's been able to read my writing, and she's put this morning, as in I put incident this morning. I think she's added that because she wasn't fully aware of what that said.
You'd written this morning, and then she's written it herself.
Yeah, I think what I've done, I've written it, and thereafter I've handed it to herself and Keith to examine to see if they were happy with it, and I think it's potentially Leslie's writing.
So it was approved by Perk?
Yes.
And that was then delivered to, was it DS Dursley? As
To
he
Robson.
indicated,
I think
or
Dursley. I think Dursley came in at that time, and he was given it. I think either by myself or via Colin. I think it was potentially handed by myself to him.
So this was the first occasion that a death message mentioned that officers had been attempting to arrest Sheikh Bayo.
Yes.
Right. Now, we've heard evidence that there is no copy of the first death message, no written record of that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that, or do you?
Yeah, I don't think there is. Yeah.
Right. But in relation to this message, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a reference to it in your daybook.
Yes, it is.
On page 6 at the bottom.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just check.
So that's PS 18269,
Yeah.
page 6, and it's just beneath a redacted passage.
Yeah.
And it says disclosure to next of kin, and then there's an entry there. Do you want to read that out for us,
so
please?
during the arrest of the male on Highfield Road around 07:15 hours this morning, the subject has become unconscious on arrival at hospital, despite the best efforts of medical staff, has died.
And we'll just get that on the screen. Now that wording is...
It's different, yeah.
It's different. So explain to us
So that
how
was,
this came about.
So that was really just my initial draft of what I was suggesting that we would put out, which thereafter led to the wider discussion with Leslie at DCS Bowl and DSI Keith Harrower, which thereafter led to an extension of that to what was on the screen shortly, which was the message that was delivered.
So this was your initial draft, and then it became the handwritten
I think it's
version.
in the policy file.
Let's look at your policy file as well. So that's PS 17854.
I think it's one of the actions. Yeah, so I think it's decision number 23.
All right, can I ask
Oh, no,
you
sorry,
about
it's not.
14 first of all?
Sorry, it's not. That's the one for the officers.
Right.
14.
Can I ask you about 14, because it does talk about wording
Yeah.
changed involving DCS Bowl seems to be
Yeah.
mentioned as well. Could you read out your
Yeah, so that is the one. So it's due to this is after the first message has been delivered. So it's a due to request for further information from the next of kin. Decision made to provide form of words indicating incident involving Police Scotland officers. Wording developed with DC as Bowl and provided to DS Graham, I couldn't recall his name at the time, but this was Graham Dursley, for transmission to officers at Locus.
So this was the second death message
Yes.
that's referred to there. And let's see what the reasoning is just below on
Yeah,
that
to
page.
provide next of kin and family with further information regarding the death of Sheku Bayo.
So had you been made aware, either by Colin Robson or through discussion with DS Dursley, that the family had been concerned and asking a number of questions?
Yeah, that, as I previously stated, that's why we went for the second message.
Right. And looking at the second death message, and we can have the handwritten version back on screen if you wish, can I ask you about the content of that? This is the first time there's been mention of police contact.
Yeah.
There we are. There's mention that he became unconscious and was taken by by ambulance to Scottish Ambulance Service, and despite best efforts by the medical staff, died shortly after 9. We've discussed that death message with Mitchell and Parker and others, Dursley and Robson. Looking at that now, what are your views about whether that, it clearly shared more information, but do you think that shared sufficient information with the family?
So it was based, as I stated previously, on the information I had at the time that I could verify. So the incident this morning, the location of where it occurred, the actions of Police Scotland officers, to the best of my knowledge, what I had at that time, the fact he had become unconscious at the Locus, he conveyed to hospital by Scottish Ambulance Service, and he had died within the hospital despite the best efforts. So the 5 main areas are what I knew at that particular time.
Looking back now at the way the death messages were delivered, we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that she was told that Mr. Bayo had been found dead. She gave evidence about having made reference to passer-by having found Mr. Bayo. She left the police office, under the impression he'd been murdered. She knew nothing of him having been conveyed by ambulance and having died after medical staff were intervened. We've heard evidence from Caddy Johnson about the first death message and differences between what Colette was told and what she was told. And then we see this third death message with more information. So in hindsight, looking back on how these death messages were relayed to the family and to Colette Bell, do you have any comments to make about how that could have been done differently?
I mean, it's such a significant aspect in an investigation that you get that information right, and there's a consistent message throughout your engagement with the family at all times. I can't, what the officers told to Colette Bell, and I'm aware of Colette Bell's evidence, but I would find it unlikely the officers would have said something like that in the knowledge that they had. And again, the message to the family was extremely brief and short, with, as I said, with the rationale in my head and Leslie's that we would deploy family liaison almost immediately, but that could have done, we could have basically set this set of words to, and I take your point around that, this could have been the death message initially to the family and not simply that Mr. Bayo had passed away. So you can only base it on the information you have at that time, and again, it does appear cold. It appears it's not transparent. It appears that there's other information that we may have that we're holding back on. I can understand all that. However, I based what I had there on what I knew at the particular time. There was very little more that I knew at that stage, to be honest with you, to give the family.
So from the perspective of SIO,
Yeah.
and from the perspective of the investigation
Yeah.
and integrity of the investigation, this second death message as delivered to the Johnsons could have been delivered to Colette Bell in the morning. Is that what you're saying?
So I obviously wasn't there at the time, and
No, no,
I had no
no.
control over that because that was done without my knowledge. So
But do you, look, as SIO, do you see any
Yeah, no,
information in here that couldn't have been shared with Colette Bell in the morning?
So at that stage in the morning, we are really just getting a grip of exactly what's occurred. So Colette's with us, I think, from about 9:45 to about 11 o'clock, I believe. And again, that is such an early part of the investigation. It's limited to what we know at that stage. By the time we delivered this at 3 o'clock or thereabouts, we had filled in significant gaps in respect of the timeline and the movements of the deceased.
Looking at this message, is there any information in this message that wasn't available to you in the morning?
No.
Is there any reason that this information couldn't have been shared with Colette Bell in the morning?
Probably not. However, we were looking at, obviously, discussing in more detail with the next of kin at the time. As I say, it was unusual that we would, the first person we made aware of the death of Mr. Bio was the partner, which is unusual. But again, just with the circumstances, I can understand why they did do it. So it was unusual, and the information they gave was extremely brief at that time. Now, that may be one of two things. One, that the officers delivering the message weren't fully aware of exactly what's contained within this death message when they're speaking to her at 10 o'clock in the morning or 10:30. And again, the direction by Colin Robson may have been something different at that particular stage prior to him making me aware that they had delivered that death message. So there's no reason why it couldn't have been. The information was known at that particular stage, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. You talked about, you used the word consistent,
Yeah.
and I'm interested in your experience of death messages. We've heard that the first death message to the Johnsons wasn't noted down. And I'm interested in whether your understanding is that death messages are not normally written down.
I mean, they are and they aren't, to be honest with you. There's no hard and fast rule with them. I mean, a lot of times it's a normal course of the duty of a police officer, whether it's a uniform officer on patrol who's to be inform a family of a death of a family member, maybe in another part of the UK or elsewhere. They will simply be told the information that they have is that it's passed away and could they make contact with such and such. So again, that information would be very, very limited at that time. In respect of kind of major crime investigation, it is normally kind of written down, 9 times out of 10 it's written down, to be honest with you, the first death message, which is delivered by, again, usually detectives prior to the involvement of the family liaison officers. They would basically run it through the SIO or the deputy SIO around the fact this is what we're intending to deliver as such. So again, in my experience, it normally is written down what is delivered to the family at that time.
And in terms of ensuring consistency, if that message is shared with more than one member of the family or next of kin or partner, how does writing it down assist with that?
It's a form of words. It's a form of words that are there to basically deliver that consistent message.
And so I suppose the flip side of that, if it's not written down anywhere, how do you ensure that consistency?
Well, in respect to this one, we ensured the consistency was we ensured that the officers who delivered the original death message to Colette delivered the same wording and the same message to the next of kin initially for that death message.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to look at the minutes for a gold group meeting the next day, if I may, just to complete this. So this is PS 03161. Sorry, I've rushed too far ahead. I'm interested in looking at the 2015 Gold Group minutes, which are PS 06493. Sorry, we will come back to that one. And again, this, I think you gave evidence about this last week, that there was a Gold Group meeting at 8:15 in the evening. And again, you attended, Houston attended, and I think we moved down the page, we'll see that PERC were also there. And so were MIT and John Ferguson, who was also from PERC, as I understand it.
John was, yeah.
Yes. And if we could look at page 2, agenda item 3, please. I'm interested in, let's move further down. Let's look at 5, family concerns. And it says that, thank you, we were there. Chief Superintendent McEwen discussed brother-in-law of deceased. He is part of an independent advisory group and had advised the initial attending officers that he knew Mr McEwen and requested that he attend and speak to him within 24 hours. Chief Superintendent and Chief Inspector Shepherd attended at home address of next of kin, highly charged environment, deceased partner Colette and extended family within. Family concerned the early contact that had been purposely vague. Was purposely vague. They were unhappy. They had not been told anything about who contacted the police and ambulance. Chief Superintendent provided them with an understanding of events. Chief Superintendent discussed the role of the PERC and reassured them it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident. Task. Family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. And then if we just move on to the next page, it goes on. Discussed that police did not know next of kin whilst Colette was at police station. Chief Superintendent discusses initial decision to have Police Scotland flows, but now hand over to PERC flows for arrangement to gain entry to house of deceased, recollecting belongings for child. Discussion re-initial contact on phone from PERC. Chief Superintendent discusses family desperate to know about PM and also arrangements on having them conveyed to mortuary in Edinburgh. Task to address all family issues raised. I'd like to go through this agenda item with you if you don't mind, ask some questions. If we go back to the top, please. So tell us about the discussion in relation to the visit by Chief Superintendent McEwen.
Yeah, so that was Chief Superintendent McEwen discussed at the conclusion of the second goal group with there was a small group, myself, the chair, ACC Nicholson, DCS Bowl were present. I think Nicky Shepherd was potentially there as well. And Gary had indicated, or Chief Superintendent McEwen had indicated that he was aware of the brother-in-law of the deceased. And that also came back from the 2 officers who had delivered the second death message, that a family member had asked for Mr McEwen to make contact with the family or provide them with some further information at that time. So on the return of the 2 officers to Kirkcaldy, that information was passed through Dursley to Robson, to myself, that they had actually requested or suggested that Gary makes contact with them, Chief Superintendent McEwen, to basically provide them with some further information around that. And that was due to they knew each other from, I think, a previous or a forum within Fife. So that discussion took place, and this was the aspect of we were aware of the kickback and the resistance from the family around about Police Scotland officers being involved in any aspect of this at the conclusion of delivering the second death message, and the decision was made myself and Leslie. There was no point in actually at that time deploying Police Scotland flows. I think I provided that information previously because of that resistance, and it would be more beneficial that we simply deploy flows from PERC when they do attend. And I know DSI Keith Harrow was trying at that time to get PERC flows to attend that evening around that. But Gary had offered to attend, Chief Superintendent McEwen had offered to attend at the family home with Chief Inspector Shepherd and tried to basically answer some of the difficult questions that they had, and that was agreed by the ACC that he agreed that may well be beneficial at this stage. As I say, it's unusual for a Chief Superintendent to attend at the next of kin's home address or the Silver Commander, as Gary was, but as I say, I could see the rationale behind that.
And was that a reflection of the nature of the family's concerns and the contact that we've heard Addie Johnson had with Gary McEwen?
I think it was both. I think it was the previous relationship that they had, but also it just wasn't appropriate at that time to deploy Police Scotland flows, and myself and Leslie agreed with that, just because of the resistance that it basically came from them. And
was that resistance or concern from the family only about Fife police officers, or was it any police officers?
I think it was Police Scotland officers in general, but in particular Fife officers, because of the nature of the incident. But I think that Fife officers are Police Scotland officers.
And we have heard that there may have been investigators in Perk who were former police officers.
Yeah.
Was that a concern of the families that you were aware of in relation to Perk as well?
No, I wasn't aware of that, no.
And you'll see there that it says Chief Superintendent, that's Gary McEwen, provided them with an understanding of events. Chief Superintendent discussed the role of the Perk and reassured them, the family, it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident.
Yeah.
What area did P Division cover?
That was Fife. That was Kirkcaldy and the surrounding Fife area.
So, not just Kirkcaldy police
No.
officers, Lochgelly, Cooper, officers from that.
Mm-hmm.
And when he reassured the family it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident, what awareness was there within the Gold Group that in fact there were officers from P Division helping with the investigation?
So I think Gary's referring to the fact that he knew at that stage it was going to Major Investigation Team officers, so it was going to the MIP, and that there wouldn't be any police P Division officers involved in it whatsoever, and it would be PIRC led, so I think that's why he can reassure them that there wouldn't be anyone involved within that division in the investigation.
I'm interested in, we talked last week about it being PIRC led, but you talked about the fact they only had 4 or 5 investigators who were brought to Kirkcaldy to deal with the matter. And as I understood your evidence last week, you were talking about police officers continuing to be a resource that PIRC would rely on in carrying out the investigation. And was there a view that P Division officers should not be involved in the investigation?
No, not at that stage. I mean, the following the 4th of May, we moved on to the MIT coming in numbers, Major Investigation Team coming in numbers to manage the investigation with PIRC. As I said in previous evidence, is that there were a number of P Division officers not from the Kirkcaldy area but had come in from elsewhere in P Division and were managing critical actions. So they continued doing that for the first day around that, and I was more than content where they were with it. However, with the eventual end game with this is that after the 3rd of May we were going to move to a complete PIRC-led, MIT-supported investigation for the entirety.
So on the 3rd of May, P Division officers did continue to be involved, but the following day, the 4th of May, you said there were no P Division officers involved?
There may have been 1 or 2 just to basically tidy up 1 or 2 actions that they were involved in, but in general we were removing all P Division officers from the inquiry.
So when you say tidying up on the 4th, what sort of things do you mean?
I mean, they may have, without getting into individual officers and what actions they had at this time, it's difficult to say. I mean, an action may require further investigation to eliminate what your action has been asked. So if you're asked to, such as eliminate Pat Campbell from the investigation, I mean, it's maybe checking his statements, CCTV, the movements, corroboration of his movements. So again, there may be other aspects that they would be asked just to conclude that action around what they had at that time. But again, the intention, as I say, was that we would not utilise P Division officers for the investigation itself.
So the intention was there, but perhaps P Division officers did continue for a period of time to complete actions.
And that discussion was at an early stage between myself and Leslie Bowl, round about the intention was to attempt to utilise Police Scotland detectives from out with the Fife area, and that was an earlier discussion with Leslie. You know what I mean? When I was made aware of it, that whole transparency, the kind of independent aspect of it. Although I had no concerns with the P Division officers, but it just how kind of through the lens how that may look as such. So as I say, it was there was an earlier discussion with myself and Leslie around that, but due to the fact that the resources were tight in the early part of the investigation, and some of the P Division officers from out with Kirkcaldy had really significant actions around about Colette Bell, around about one or two other significant witnesses. My take on that is we would continue with them in respect to that. I didn't see anything around any integrity issues with it. And
when you use the phrase how it would look through the lens, what would the concerns be as far as you were aware? So, I mean, I think
what we were almost preempting was the fact is that what we were moving towards on day 2 would be a completely independent investigation from without P Division officers having any footprint on it at all. So, day 1, early stages, you're going to have that. The aspect of local officers still being involved in it, but with the intention eventually you move towards an investigation solely resourced from a Police Scotland perspective by major investigation team officers, which would support the PIRC-led investigation.
When was the point reached, as far as you're aware, where you were satisfied that no P Division officers were involved in the investigation?
So I was involved in it for the first 2 days. I couldn't answer that, to be honest with you. I'm not sure, but I know that that's where we were moving towards. But as I say, one day just merged into the other day, as you can imagine.
Right. And in terms of the remit of PIRC, we talked last week about that and how we'll hear further evidence about this. But it may be that there were 5 letters from the Crown Office extending the remit of PIRC over a period of time.
Right.
Okay. And what clarity did you have on the 3rd or the 4th of May as to the precise remit and scope of the investigation to be carried out by PIRC?
So my understanding, and I hadn't seen the terms of reference that you're referring to there, was that the PIRC were the lead investigation and would examine the lead up to the death of Mr Bio, as well as the subsequent actions of the response to his death. And that was my initial understanding for day 1 and day 2, what their remit was. There were other aspects that may well have fallen to Police Scotland officers round about some of the background or whatever, but that whole focus on the incident at Hayfield Road and the subsequent response around that was quite clear in my head that sat with PIRC leading on it.
But in terms of having a clear picture available to you as to what parts of the investigation may remain with Police Scotland and what parts were handed over to PIRC.
Yes.
Looking back now, do you feel that you had a clear picture in your mind of what parts perhaps remained with Police Scotland and what parts were handed over? Yeah,
I mean, it was clear that I mean, we were supporting PIRC from the early morning of the 3rd of May. It was their investigation. We were simply supporting it. We had the assets on the ground at that time to manage it. I don't think the terms of reference and the visibility of the terms of reference from a Police Scotland perspective came until potentially the end of day 2, day 3. And I think that was into Keith Hardy, who had taken over my role as such around it, but certainly I had no visibility at all of what the terms of reference were. we were running with the priorities which we've already discussed around that, but with the more detailed aspect of how the kind of choreography of the investigation would thereafter play out was something that would be managed between PIRC and the major investigation teams more than myself as responding to it.
So you talked last week about was it the golden hour or the golden hours?
Yeah.
And during that period, is that a fixed period or is it?
It can last more than an hour.
And during that period, was it essentially Police Scotland that were doing the
Yes.
investigation?
Yes.
I wonder if that would be an
For a
appropriate
convenient point, well, we'll take a 20-minute break. Ms. Graham.
Can I ask you, was there a formal handover to Perk in the morning? You were made aware they were taking the lead in the investigation, and I'm interested in whether there was some sort of formal handover at that stage, or did that happen later?
Are you talking at 10:22 when I speak to Keith Harrower?
Yes, you had that initial conversation with Keith Harrower at that time in the morning.
Yeah, so no, I mean, it was clear. Keith obviously informed me at that time that he had been instructed to lead on the investigation by Crown Office. So it was clear. It was clear to me before that, to be honest with you. It had been informed at 9:35 by Craig Blackhall, who had that discussion with Dave Green from Crown Office. And Craig had contacted me back to inform me that Perk would lead on the investigation. So at 10:20, when Keith contacted me, Keith just reinforced the fact it was going to be Perk-led.
And what about a formal handover where you give a briefing?
Yeah, so that really didn't happen until through the course of the day. I mean, the Perk attended 13:30, 13:35 hours. We get into an investigative briefing at that time, thereafter into a goal group, thereafter into a forensic strategy meeting, and thereafter a further goal group that evening. So the inquiry was still, although being led by Keith as a lead investigator for Perk, was heavily supported by myself and my resources from Police Scotland at that time. And I didn't actually do a handover in respect of my role to Keith Hardy, the DCI from the MIT, until I think it was the second day after the post-mortem examination. So I continued with that involvement all the way through the second day as well. But it was clear round about and again, that whole aspect that the question asked about a formal handover, that was a kind of gradual process through the different forums and meetings and the progression of the investigation around the fact once Holmes, the Holmes team were into the investigation in day two, and the more defined structure around about Perk-led, fully supported by MIT, was thereafter going to take the investigation on over the coming days and weeks.
So if we look at your policy file, I think you gave evidence last week about the handover to Keith Hardy from MIT.
Yeah.
And I think, is that at the rear of your policy file?
Yeah.
It may be decision number 22, if I'm right. I may be wrong in that. No, it's not that one.
So I think Keith's detailed it. So 24 is the...
24.
Yeah, and then 25 is Keith basically indicating that that's meeting that handovers occurred with Keith Harrower. Sorry, with Keith Hardy.
So 24 mentions Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen.
Sorry, decision 20.
Sorry, I'm
at 20.
Decision
Sorry,
24.
29 it is. Sorry.
29.
Sorry, it's just my writing.
No, not at all. So decision number 29, page 61478. And what does that say?
It's handover meeting with Detective Supt, but it's actually DCI Keith Hardy at Livingston Police Office.
Right. So that's the official handover to Keith Hardy at MIT.
So it actually happened the previous evening on the 4th. However, it just basically ran into the morning of the 5th. And the morning of the 5th, I met Keith out at Livingston Police Office. And we sat down, had a coffee and had done a more thorough handover in respect to some of the areas that we were going to concentrate on at that time and some of the work that had been carried out. So Keith had a full understanding of where we were.
Tell me when the handover with Keith Hardy was the previous day. That wasn't a formal handover.
No,
then.
it was during the progress of the evening of the 4th. There was a meeting after the post-mortem examination results came through. I think it was around about 1930, 1935. It was a meeting between... so what actually happened on that day was that the PIRC had changed on the 4th their lead investigator. So Keith Hardy stood down. I think he was on annual leave, I'm not sure. Harrower, sorry. And Billy Little took on that role. So
I think you mentioned that last week.
and basically what that sort of happened was that Keith Hardy and Billy Little had attended the post-mortem examination, and Keith had contacted me with the result. Thereafter, I'd arranged with a meeting with Billy Little back at Kirkcaldy office that evening. I think it took place prior to the last goal group in that meeting, and that was really just a kind of more definitive handover with Perk at that stage, because Billy Little was coming on to at that point.
So that was the 4th.
That was the evening of the 4th,
after.
the day after, yeah.
And do you remember what time that handover
I think it was 1930. It might have been detailed in my actual policy file, actually.
I was going to ask you, is
28, I think it's 28. Meeting with Perk new lead Billy Little regarding the scope of the investigation to date. And then instruction from DS Bowl, ACC Nicholson, that inquiry will now rest with the MIT SIO Detective Super. But it was actually DCI Keith Hardy that was the lead on it.
Right, so there was a meeting with the new lead, Billy Little.
Yes.
That was the 4th of May.
The evening of the 4th, after the post-mortem examination.
After the post-mortem and before the gold group meeting. And, or maybe there wasn't, but did you just say there was a gold group meeting on the evening of the 4th?
Yeah, 1950 or 2015, I think it was the 2015 one.
I thought that was on the 3rd of May.
Sorry, the 3rd, yeah. Sorry. No, the 4th of May was the post-mortem in the afternoon, and there was a meeting with myself and Perk on the evening at Kirkcaldy office at 19:30 with Billy Little, and some of the Perk reps ran about a more thorough kind of handover with Billy at that time.
So that was a handover to Billy Little, who was taking on the lead role for Perk. What about an official handover to the Harrower? He was for Perk on the 3rd of May.
Yeah, so that more thorough investigative handover was prior to the second goal group, around about 1400 hours on the 3rd of May. That was a meeting I explained around about my team plus Keith's team, and around about that. These are the investigative priorities, and this is where we are with it, just bringing Keith and the team fully up to date where we were with things.
So Perk arrive at Kirkcaldy roughly 1:30.
Yeah.
You go into a meeting with Perk.
Mm-hmm.
That's the handover to Perk as far as you're concerned?
So it was very clear in my head from 9:30 this was Perk led. I mean, I think round about the mechanics and the priorities and all that had all been discussed through the course of the morning with Keith, although remotely. But this was the first time we'd actually been able to sit round a table and discuss it in detail. So round about handover as such, I was always aware that they were leading on it. I mean, it was Keith's ultimate decision round about the actions and priorities and anything to do with the investigation, but round about that more thorough, full investigative update came prior to the goal group meeting.
So if we're thinking about a handover where you hand over responsibility or the investigation to Perk, when did that take place?
So I would suggest it was before the goal group meeting, the 1440 one, round about that investigative handover, whereby Keith actually at Kirkcaldy office leading on the investigation in person with the support from myself and my team around that. So
and is that Keith Harrower?
Keith Harrower, yeah.
And they're in Kirkcaldy at that time?
Yes.
So is that handover noted in the policy file?
I don't think it is, but as I say, it was it was very clear in both our heads that at 10 o'clock, 10:30, when Keith phones me at 10:22, that they were leading on it. It wasn't a case of handing over as such. They were always leading on it from very early that morning. It was just a case of a more thorough investigative update to ensure that they were fully cited on all aspects of the investigation to date. But as in an official handover, it was clear from 9:30 in the morning to me that this was not Police Scotland led, this was Perk led. But they did require significant support around it.
Looking back now, do you think that having a formal part of the process where there was an official handover and setting out the scope of what was being handed over would maybe have assisted?
I don't think so. I think from the investigative priorities and the areas under my control at that early stage in the handover, I don't really see anything at all we could have done any better. with the exception of the family liaison aspect of it, which we've already discussed. I think the problem with the PIRC deployment at that stage, other than the resources, is that over the course of 24, 36 hours, they changed the lead investigator. So Keith
what issues did that cause?
well, just the obvious challenges. The fact is, you're bringing someone on fresh into the investigation when you've been there for 12, 13 hours at that stage. You know what I mean? Before Billy Little's appointed around that. So again, there was challenges with the fact that the change of a senior investigator from PIRC at an early stage of a critical investigation would undoubtedly cause challenges.
When you use the word challenges, what do you mean? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, just a natural awareness of the investigation and where the priorities lay, and what some of the issues that we came across during the course of the 3rd of May, from early in the morning right through to the evening, and as well as obviously the challenges with the family liaison and some of the problems that we'd encountered that day. So again, what we had was that the Keith Harwood had been fully briefed on it through the course of that morning into the afternoon, into the evening, and thereafter we have a change of senior investigator from the PIRC side, which, to be honest with you, if we'd done that with Police Scotland and we changed our SIO after day one, it caused the same problems, because it leads to potential confusion, it leads to more additional briefings having to be given to who's come in to take on that particular role. So, as I say, probably not the best practice in respect of how you run an investigation.
Is that the type of thing that Police Scotland would do, change a senior investigator?
So we would normally do a handover now at this stage, and at 2015 we were in the very early stages of it, whereby the majority of homicides and extended investigations would normally sit with the major investigation team. So what would happen, and what did usually happen, is that I would go out and deal with the initial stages of a homicide, and within a couple of days I would do a handover to the major investigation team to basically thereafter take the investigation on, which would probably run for a number of weeks or months. So that's the way it does work with Police Scotland, but the initial stages is still with the on-call detective super or the detective chief super who would see that aspect of it. But the great majority of investigations, unless the homicide is quickly resolved, they normally fall with the major investigation teams to take primacy on.
And that's within a couple of days, did you say?
Yeah.
Why was, if you have awareness of this, why was Billy Little not involved on the 3rd of May?
I genuinely don't know. As I say, I'd given no indication by DSI Keith Harrower that he was intending on not being there on the 4th as such, so I don't actually know why that was. There's something in my mind that makes me think that he was going on annual leave, but I'm unsure on that. I don't know how I've got that information, but that's maybe came from Billy Little.
So was it a surprise to you that he wasn't there on the 2nd day?
Yeah, I wasn't. I think I'd been made aware on the evening of the 3rd, but again, I can't recall exactly who made me aware of that. But I knew Billy Little was coming on to run the investigation from the PIRC side.
And how were you feeling about this change in PIRC of their senior investigator?
It really didn't make any significant of note to me. There was nothing at all. I mean, it was just a case of I would have to now go back and brief the new DSI coming on, although there is absolutely no doubt. I mean, Keith Harwood would have gave Billy quite an extensive handover, I would imagine, know what I mean, in respect to that. And that was clear when I spoke to Billy Little. He was aware of the work that had been progressed over that period of time. But as I say, it's I think it was mainly due to the kind of personal circumstances of Keith Harwood. He was finishing after that particular day, which I think it was potentially a pre-planned holiday that he had or whatever. So again, from my own perspective, it really didn't matter that much, to be honest.
When Billy Little came in on the 4th, did he change any of the decisions that had been made or priority actions that had been identified?
So I don't recall. However, I had a briefing. I chaired a joint. I think we've seen the document minutes. I chaired a meeting which was an investigative meeting on the morning of the 4th, around about 10 o'clock. And I'm sure Billy Little was at that with a number of other PIRC resources who had attended that morning, as well as Police Scotland MIT resources. I can't recall them changing anything at this stage. Again, I may be wrong with that.
Can I go back to the minutes of the evening meeting of the Gold Group 2015? We were looking at that just before the break. PS 06493. I hadn't quite completed the questions I wanted to ask you about that. Could we look at item 5 again, please? So that's the bottom of page 2, I think. So it says there, task, family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. And then if we can go on to the next page, paragraph 3, Chief Superintendent discusses family desperate to know about post-mortem and also arrangements on having them conveyed to mortuary in Edinburgh, and tasked to address all family issues raised. Can I ask you about the nature of this part of the discussion at the Gold Group meeting, about the family's concerns?
Yeah, so the family concerns were obviously around, as it states here, around about the post-mortem arrangements and how quick that they had actually been put in place for the following day. And that's what's detailed there with, we have the Chief Super, Gary McEwen,
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
When you say they were concerned about how quick the post-mortem had been put in place the following day, we've heard evidence that the family didn't know that the post-mortem was going to take place on the 4th of May until they found out on the 5th of May in the morning. So can you think back to this discussion, which is at 2015 on the 3rd of May, and tell us what your recollection of that discussion is?
Yeah, so the discussion at that time was that the family liaison, the post-mortem arrangements would sit solely with PIRC at that stage, because of the challenges that we had from Police Scotland perspective. And that resulted in, obviously, following this, we had Keith Harwer contacting the family via telephone and thereafter arranging to visit the family to make them aware of the arrangements for the post-mortem examination, and that we would be requiring family members for identification. So I'm not sure exactly what Keith explained to the family around about the arrangements for the post-mortem examination.
Keith Harrower.
Keith Harrower, yep. But that aspect of it, following this Gold Group, sat solely with PIRC. The deployment of family liaison officers to the family from PIRC and not Police Scotland, and the liaison with the family in its entirety would sit with PIRC and not with Police Scotland at that time.
Right. Subject, of course, to any other arrangements through Chief Superintendent McEwen.
So there wasn't any other arrangements?
There wasn't anything else?
No.
And so where it says task at the end of item 5 to address all family issues raised, that was a task to be carried out by PIRC.
By PIRC, yeah.
And I think we said before the break that this was a meeting that was attended by Keith Harrower and John Ferguson from PIRC.
To the family?
No, they were present at the Gold Group
At the
meeting.
Gold Group, at this meeting, yeah.
So they were aware of this part of the
Yeah.
discussion. And there was mention on the previous page, just at the bottom, about the family wanting reassurance and not wishing anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who's in London. Do you remember any part of the discussion regarding Mr. Bio's mother who was in London?
Yeah, I can. I think she had planned to travel up to Scotland the following day or the days after this, but it was coming from Gary McEwen, to be honest with you. The only aspect of that was that I had any input on was that I'd spoke to Dave Green around the post-mortem examination. I think I spoke about this last week, round about, in the absence of any formal identification, what was the fallback options around that? And Dave Green explained to me at that time that there was no flexibility with the timing of the post-mortem examination the following day due to the availability of pathologists.
I think you did mention that last week.
So that's the only aspect I have on it, but I can recall Gary mentioning that the deceased mother resided in London and was travelling up.
From your memory of that meeting, was there What impression did you have about the family's perception or attitude towards the post-mortem and about a formal identification taking place with their involvement?
So my understanding from that forum that I can recall was that there was still resistance from the family about attending to identify Mr. Bio prior to the post-mortem actually taking place the following day.
And when you say resistance, can you help us understand what your impression was of the level of that resistance?
It really came from Gary McEwen, to be honest with you, and it was really about the fact that they had made it clear that they would not attend for the post-mortem examination for the identification aspect.
We've heard evidence that they wished to give time for the deceased's mother to arrive from London before they would formally identify Mr. Bio prior to the post-mortem. Do you have any recollection of that being expressed at this Gold Group meeting?
No, and as I say, that whole aspect of post-mortem identification, liaison with the family, passed straight over to PIRC in respect of any involvement. There had been no involvement at all after this forum.
Was there any discussion about clarifying the family's position in relation to the post-mortem?
I think there was, and I think that thereafter sat with Keith Harrower to make that engagement with the family, and that thereafter led to the subsequent phone call and visit to the family that evening.
Right. But again, that was something that you understood PIRC to be taking control of.
That was very clear in respect to that.
And did you have any other involvement with that matter from this meeting?
No, and I think I detailed it in one of my policy logs around about the fact that that whole aspect sat with PIRC.
Do you want to look at the policy log and just identify? It may be decision 17. I'm not sure. There's mention there of the family and the post-mortem.
No, that was just about the various aspects that I discussed with Dave Green around the.
Right.
Other
Sorry.
than, but I think there was an additional entry. Yeah, I think 22, maybe just clarify it. I don't know if I'll clarify it a bit.
22.
No, sorry, that's in the 4th. That's the day after, actually.
Right.
It was just about the flows from the PIRC to be deployed to deliver the cause of death to the family. No, it's. I don't think I've detailed it.
Do you want to look at your day book? Maybe you have something in there. If we go to page 6, we were talking about the death message note that you'd taken at the end,
Yeah.
and then on the right hand side there's some notes that you've taken.
Yeah.
And then they go on to the next page, 7.
No, I don't think there's anything at all.
Nothing
around
there.
that. No.
Right. But in any event, that's your recollection
Yeah.
now. And if we could go back to the minutes, sorry, which are PS 06493. I'd like to come on to agenda item 12, which is at the bottom of page 3. And it's just any other business. And then if we move on to the top of the following page, there are actions listed. And one action is liaise with PIRC redeployment of their FLOs, not deploying FLOs of Police Scotland.
Yeah.
So was it at this meeting that decision was taken not to deploy the Police
It
Scotland
was actually
FLOs?
before that, but that was rubber stamped at that forum.
Right.
As such, by the gold.
And we've heard you gave evidence last week that officers had been recalled to duty
Yes.
and brought Kirkcaldy to act as FLOs, but they were then released from that obligation.
Correct.
At that stage. And then it says a definitive resolution is required, re-contact with family and reassurance to them. Can you explain what that was?
So I think it was that discussion round about did this now best sit with the PIRC to take on in its entirety around any future liaison with the family? I think that kind of explains it a wee bit below and about the PIRC regarding family and the arrangements.
So it says Chief Superintendent not adverse to going back
Yeah.
to the house if required to assist with retrieving items for the baby of Colette Bell, but telephone contact to be made by PIRC, re the family and arrangements, etc., for conveying to mortuary.
Yeah.
So certainly at that Gold Group meeting, can you tell us what your understanding was in relation to the family, the purpose for the family being conveyed to the mortuary? You'll see we've noted that previously on page 3, where at the top of that page, this was at the end of item 5, there was comment about arrangements on having them, the family, can be conveyed to the mortuary in Edinburgh, and then that's repeated under action on the final page. So again, can you explain your understanding of why this was being discussed, of the family being conveyed to the mortuary?
So that's normal arrangements that we would make for a deceased family, other than trying to get them to explain and where the city mortuary is and where to park and so on and so forth. The family liaison officers would normally convey the family or the next of kin to the mortuary and thereafter explain the whole process of identification. Again, that's pretty normal arrangements for any incident as such.
Was the purpose of this for identification?
Yes, it would be, yeah.
So at this Gold Group meeting, was it your understanding that the family would have some involvement with identification prior to the post-mortem?
I think it was intended and it was hoped that they would, but again that thereafter passed in its entirety to Keith Harrower and PIRC to manage that engagement with the family around the post-mortem arrangements.
So you won't know whether it was explained to the family that there was no flexibility in relation to the timing of the post-mortem?
No, that would need to come from Keith Harrower.
Right, so we'd have to hear evidence from him about that. Thank you. I'd like to move on to the next set of minutes for the Gold Group meeting, please, which is the 4th of May 2015, and minutes that we have for 12:30 the following day. I think that's PS 03161. And you'll see these minutes. So this is the following day, 12:30. There's no reference there to who was present at that meeting. Do you remember?
I genuinely don't. I think I'd only slept for about an hour that day into the next day type thing, so I was unsure exactly who would have been at that.
Right. And you were at that anyway.
Yes, I was at it, yeah.
So we see in the factual update, paragraph 3, under the factual update, item agenda 2, we can move down, the mention of the name D.I. Stuart Wilson. Who was he?
I think Stuart was in the MIT at that time.
So this was in relation to an officer from MIT, not Hardy?
No, one of Keith Hardy's team.
What did D.I. Wilson, what was his role?
I think Stuart came on in the afternoon of the 3rd of May to offer some assistance to the investigation.
So he was part of that team?
Yeah.
And it says there, factual update, officers dispatched from Kirkcaldy and on arrival were faced with deceased to engage them physically, assaulting a female officer and fighting with others. Can you explain what the factual update was at that time? I'm interested in particular in the words, on arrival were faced with deceased to engage them physically. Can you explain that?
It looks to me as if it's been written, it looks very much kind of police talk descriptions, the way it's written, deceased to engage with them physically. It's something that we'd put in a police report as such, but I don't know who's written the minutes, to be honest with you. But I think what it genuinely means that the officers were aware of a number of calls on that morning to attend Hayfield Road, and on arrival had been involved in a physical coming together altercation with the deceased.
And you gave this factual update, did you?
I did, but it looks as if it's a very condensed version of what's actually been said.
I'm interested in whether this minute suggests that the deceased was an aggressor,
No.
or whether it just simply is talking about there being some sort of physical engagement between
Yeah.
the officers and
I
the...
think all this is a high-level synopsis, exactly what I've said, and a kind of more detailed update.
And then as we move down to item 3 on the agenda, you'll see this is investigative process, DI Stuart Wilson, and you've explained he was with MIT.
Yeah.
And if we can look at a paragraph, there are potentially 210 dwellings between Arran Crescent and Hayfield Road Locus. And you mentioned last week about house-to-house inquiries
Yeah.
being undertaken. And were those house-to-house inquiries being undertaken by Police Scotland officers?
They were under the instruction of PIRC, but supported by Police Scotland. So we had the legs on the ground as such, chapping doors. As you say, it was the house-to-house is basically split into the initial zones, the kind of priority zones that we were looking at that time, and that early discussion with PIRC was round about that they were looking to note statements from any significant, crucial eyewitnesses. If we chapped a door and we identified someone, they would ask us to make them aware, and they would attend in detail that statement.
Right.
But the great majority of the 210 houses that had to have their door chapped, that was going to be done by Police Scotland.
And you talked last week about having 20 or 22 detectives involved with the investigation under your role. Were there officers within that number who then carried out these house-to-house?
So this is the 4th of May, so this is when we have significant MIT resources now attending at Kirkcaldy to take on the investigation long term. So these were, as I say, the 95% of the resources from Police Scotland were MIT resources, with the remainder being some resources that had carried out initial actions the day before, but were just completing those actions as I discussed.
How many MIT resources came online on the 4th of May?
I'm unsure.
Can I ask you about the task that we just see at the bottom, if we can move that up slightly? Task, advice to be gained from PERC regarding the disclosure of the PM results to the officers involved in the incident. Supervisor to be identified to carry this disclosure out. I'm interested in your recollection of this item, this task on the agenda.
Yeah, so there was, obviously, we were moving towards the post-mortem examination that afternoon on the 4th of May. And I think it was Gary McEwen that had raised the matter round about, and he raised it to the chair round about the disclosure of post-mortem results to the officers involved in the restraint. So there was quite a detailed discussion around that, and PIRC were involved in it to an extent, but again, the main representative from PIRC at that time was Billy Little, who was in attendance at the City Mortuary for the PM, I believe. So there was, first of all, there was a discussion around about we would deploy PIRC flows to deliver the death message to the result of the post-mortem examination to the family. And the second aspect to that was round about, and I think it was Gary, as I say, Gary McEwen, the Chief Super, who had indicated he thought it would have been beneficial in their status as witnesses to provide for their welfare and well-being a result of the post-mortem examination as well.
Right, can I just ask you about this? This meeting took place before the post-mortem had been carried out. And you've said there was to deliver the information about the post-mortem to the family. That was going to be done by PERC, is that right?
So it was going to be done with PIRC flows.
PERC flows.
Yeah.
And was there any discussion about when that was to be done?
So that would have been done, my understanding was after the post-mortem results were known, which was on the evening of the 4th of May.
But that was under the control of PERC.
Yes.
Now, the idea of telling police officers who are witnesses the results of the post-mortem. I'm interested in how this came around because, I mean, is this something that's normally done, telling witnesses about the post-mortem?
Police witnesses or witnesses in general?
Well, first of all, would you normally tell witnesses in general?
It's not a normal process that I'm aware of that we would normally tell witnesses in general round about the result of a post-mortem examination. Family, yeah, definitely.
Is it part of a process if you've got officers involved that you would tell them if they're witnesses?
I'm aware if it has been done before in respect of deaths in custody in that respect, just round about the whole welfare, well-being aspect of it. But these aren't normal events.
Right. So when you say they're not normal events, who raised the issue about telling police officers?
So I think that was Gary McEwen as the divisional commander for P Division 5 and looking after the welfare of his officers at that time.
Did he explain at this meeting why he was making this suggestion?
No, I think he did actually, but I can't recall exactly his rationale behind it. But I think it was in the grounds of their welfare and the fact that they were obviously extremely traumatised and concerned exactly what had occurred around the restraint of Mr. Bio, and that discussion thereafter took place with the chair, with ACC Nicholson, round about. Obviously the direction or the authority for that would simply sit with PIRC and not with Police Scotland because they were the leading investigators in respect to that.
You've talked about the hypotheses last week, you've talked about keeping an open mind on all of them until you were in a position to exclude them. You've not got initial personal accounts or operational statements from the officers at this stage. What concerns did you have about, as SIO, about sharing information with the officers about the cause of death?
Yeah, so it was mainly what information we would share was, I wouldn't say was my concern, but I wanted to be made aware of what we were going to actually share with them.
And why was that?
As you say, mainly down to the hypotheses that were apparent and whether or not there had to be some further discussion around whether or not we would disclose that once we found out what the results of the post-mortem were at that point. So this discussion was based solely on welfare and well-being of the officers, about supporting them in the days and weeks ahead around what the result was. But again, my thoughts were, okay, let's see what the results of the post-mortem are, and ultimately that decision lay with PIRC. It did not lie with me.
So you expressed concerns about wanting to know what the post-mortem results were. When you later discovered what the results were, did PIRC come to you and ask you to be part of a further discussion about this matter? Tell us about that.
So, and I think I can refer to it in my policy, Phil, but they did...
Do you want to go to that?
Yeah, so I think it's policy decision number 22.
Right. Tell us what you have written here.
So sorry, can I take you action decision 20 first of all?
Yes. So decision 20 is page 61469.
Okay, so this is information coming back to me from Keith Hardy at the City Mortuary regarding the result of the post-mortem examination.
Right, let's just get this on the screen. Decision 20, 61469. And what does this say here?
Right, so information from post-mortem examination regarding cause of death, Edinburgh City Mortuary, DCI Hardy present. And I've got in inverted commas basically what Keith has informed me, unascertained pending toxicology.
When did you get that information?
So I got that round about, I think it was about 6:30 on the 4th. I got a phone call. Keith was still at the mortuary. The post-mortem had ran for, I think, the best part of 4 hours or thereabouts. And he basically phoned saying, that's it, just concluded, and here are what we have at this point. And that basically had asked that Billy Little was there at the time as well, and Billy had indicated that he was wanting a meeting now at Kirkcaldy Police Office directly after that.
And then can we look at the reasoning, please? And what does it say
Yeah, so
here?
meeting to be arranged with PIRC at 19:30 hours at Kirkcaldy Police Office to discuss findings and communications back to next of kin and family, and also to officers involved in incident.
And was that the meeting that you mentioned earlier with
Yes.
PERC? And you were present at that?
Yes, I was.
And there was a discussion as part of that meeting about whether to share the results with
Yes.
the officers. Tell us about that meeting.
So that thereafter, if you go to decision 22,
Thank you. And it says agreement with PERC.
so agreement with PIRC at meeting with the Kirkcaldy Police Office with PIRC Deputy Lead Investigator was Willie Little to progress the following. So there are 2 points that came from that meeting. Flows to be deployed, PIRC to inform next of kin of cause of death, and secondly an agreed form of words to develop by SIO and PIRC in respect of notification of officers involved in incident.
And so was that you and someone from PERC?
So it was myself and Billy Little.
And can we find that form of words?
Yeah. So that's in that's the next decision.
And this was a form of words that was to be shared with the officers
And the next of kin.
and the next of kin. Can you tell us what we see on decision number 23?
So agreed form of words with PIRC agreed. So following post-mortem examination of Sheku Bio, cause of death has been detailed as unascertained pending toxicology. There is no evidence of any blunt force trauma injury which would have been a contributory factor to Mr. Bio's death.
And what does it say on? We won't read that.
Yeah.
Reason, and then it says to ensure no mixed messages to family and others is
Passed.
passed.
Yeah. To ensure
And to ensure
consistency.
consistency. So that was a form of wording agreed to be shared with all of the officers
Yeah.
who had attended Hayfield Road
Yes.
and the next of kin,
Yeah.
as far as you understood. Do you know if PERC did share that with the next of kin?
That action was solely for PIRC to take on.
Right. And who was going to share that information with the officers?
So basically, I think I've detailed it. Yeah, I think in the next decision. So the direction for the chair at the goal group meeting, which we've already discussed, was that as soon as we were aware of the outcome and the results from the post-mortem examination, that I would inform ACC Nicholson directly around what that was. ACC Nicholson had spoke to me around the fact that he believed that message would have been would be better delivered by Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen to the officers because he had personal knowledge of them. I didn't, and that he was probably better placed around about welfare and well-being to pass that message to the officers. So again, the aspect of that decision is that Chief Superintendent briefed in. So I phoned Gary McEwen after speaking to Mr Nicholson, saying this is the cause of death. Are you quite happy for this? And I read out verbatim the information we were going to pass to the officers, and ACC Nicholson endorsed that and asked me to contact Gary McEwen and pass that information to him at that time. And I think I can recall Gary actually I think he was writing it down as I was speaking to him on the phone around what exactly he was going to say, so there would be no mixed messages around that.
And do you know who actually delivered?
I think it was Gary
Himself?
to all the officers.
To
yes.
all the officers?
Yeah.
Do you know how he did that?
So Gary had said to me that he was going to come into Kirkcaldy Police Office to do it. Now I don't know if that was to do with the privacy and he would be able to make phone calls privately within Kirkcaldy office, but he was at home at that time. So I took it he was coming in to make the phone calls from Kirkcaldy office, and it was going to be done via telephone and not in person. But again, I may be wrong with that.
Do you know when
That evening.
That evening, the 4th of May?
Yeah.
Right. So the suggestion had been raised by McEwen. The wording was drafted and noted in your policy file by you and Keith Harrower from PERC.
Yeah.
That was then approved by...
Billy Little.
Oh, sorry. It was approved by Billy Little from PERC.
Yeah.
approved by ACC Nicholson,
Yes.
and then essentially delivered to McEwen to roll out to all of the officers who had attended Hayfield Road. You've mentioned the welfare issue. We've heard evidence from Conrad Trickett that he was post-incident manager, and he was required in his role to balance the welfare of the officers and with the facilitating the investigative needs of the investigation. Why was Conrad Trickett not involved in any of these discussions?
One, he was part of the goal group. Two, the role of PIM wasn't as... We weren't aware of the whole aspect of what the PIM brought to post-incident procedures and to an investigation. So, again, it wasn't really known what his role was in respect to that, and not having him at the goal group, he didn't have the ability to provide that input round about this is what I should do in respect to that. So again...
I think last week you gave evidence that you thought, with hindsight, it would have been of benefit to have him within the goal group.
Absolutely, yeah.
So do you think in relation to this discussion that there would have been benefit in having input from Conrad Trickett as PIM?
Yeah, but ultimately that decision lay with the Gold Commander, ACC Nicholson, to who he deemed to be more appropriate to deliver that message. So again, I could see his rationale behind doing that, and not coming from Conrad.
Was it only ACC Nicholson's decision as to who should deliver it, or was it also his ultimate decision whether it should in fact be delivered?
Ultimately, yes.
And as SIO, did you have any lingering concerns about providing information to police officers who'd been at Hayfield Road in relation to the cause of death prior to actually having initial personal accounts or operational statements from them?
So, ideally, I would have preferred to be in the position of having the personal initial accounts or operational statements, but I wasn't. I knew for a fact that obviously wasn't going to happen. So my perception of the cause of death was very vague in respect of that wording which is within that. It's a pretty general result that comes from a number of post-mortem examinations where further analysis is required regarding the cause of death around that. So it was relatively brief, and it really didn't say very much, to be honest with you. You know what I mean? It was obviously pending further toxicology and pending further examination at that time. So balancing the welfare, did it impact on my investigation or the PERC investigation? Ultimately, it wasn't my decision to decide that at the time, but Billy Little was happy for that to go out to the officers concerned, and ultimately the decision lay with Billy.
So was the decision ultimately Billy Little's, or was the decision ultimately ACC Nicholson's?
So the decision to allow the message to go to the officer sat with Billy Little. The decision about who would deliver the message sat with ACC Nicholson, and that thereafter he instructed me to deliver the message to Gary McEwen to deliver to the officers.
So the decision to share information about cause of death with the attending officers,
Yes.
rested with Billy Little?
Yeah, and that's detailed in the policy file on the discussion I had with Billy Little at that time.
We may have heard that the suggestion that without information about the cause of death from the post-mortem, the officers would be unwilling to give any sort of statement. Was that part of the discussion that you had either at the Gold Group meeting or the meeting with PERC at 7:30 in the evening?
There was some reference to, I think it came from Chief Inspector Shepherd or potentially Gary McEwen. I'm not sure, that there was information about the fact that officers were not going to provide a statement until the result of the post-mortem examination. So that there was information there. It hadn't came directly to me, but it was discussed at the Goal Group, and it was perhaps an extension of what I already knew. They weren't willing to provide statements.
And what influence did that have on you as SIO. You've explained last week that there was a gap and you wanted to get statements.
So, I mean, it would have been extremely beneficial if that was the case, that they would have provided operational statements directly after that, which we know now wasn't the case. However, did it impact as SIO, and did it impact from a perspective on the information we provided the officers? I thought the information we gave them was extremely vague around the result of the post-mortem examination. As I say, I think that the legal advice they subsequently got was delay any statement at all until after toxicology comes back, and that was thereafter the delay 30 days or so because of that.
In relation to the wording of the cause of death we looked at a moment ago, there was specific reference to blunt force trauma and that not having been part of the cause of death. What were the particular reasons for noting blunt force trauma?
So that all came from the information that I was given from Keith Hardy, who was at the post-mortem examination. So again, it was, as I say, very vague information at that time, but again, it was, the cause of death was unascertained at that time, so again, we were not eliminating any potential hypothesis at that stage.
We've heard about PC Tomlinson and his concerns when he returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office on the morning that he'd struck Mr. Bio on the head on a number of occasions with his baton. And we've heard other evidence that striking someone with a baton to the head is a red zone, I think it was called, or a red area that can cause death. Was there any part of the discussion or the rationale or the thinking to provide some sort of reassurance to PC Tomlinson that he had not caused death as a result of striking Mr. Bio to the head with a baton?
Yeah, so I didn't have that information when about Tomlinson.
Right.
So the information we passed to the officers was a form of words which was agreed between Pirk and myself, but ultimately Pirk signed off on it. And as I say, for me it was relatively vague around about what information we were passing to the officers. The information you explained to me I wasn't aware of, and that obviously came subsequently during the noting of more extensive statements and accounts, but at that stage, as I said before, and I've consistently said, the gap was the fact that I didn't have that information, which would have gave me that, allowed me to fill the gap from an investigative perspective.
So even though we've heard evidence from PC Tomlinson that he came back and he spoke to officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office, in particular, I think Austin Barrett, that wasn't information that was available to you on the 3rd of May?
No, there was no information at all coming to me from the officers or from the Federation. Austin Barrett obviously was a Federation member, but I never met Austin Barrett on the day. It was Amanda Given, but as I already gave evidence, Amanda Given's direction was that they would not be providing statements. Reflecting now on the decision to share that information with the officers, it may be said that there is a perception on the part of the family or the public more widely and concern that people who were witnesses but where they had not given initial accounts or operational statements were being shared information about cause of death, and concern that that might influence in some way their own account, which they'd not yet given. Can you understand that decision could give rise to concern in public perception and perception with the family? Yeah.
And how would that impact on your role as SIO?
So the information we gave, when we gave the officers that information, they were witnesses. Their status did not change at all through the course of my involvement with them. There was no reasonable cause to suspect that they had been involved in any criminality or any misconduct. From the information, and the very vague information we had, was that force had been reasonable. But again, there was huge amount of gaps within what had actually happened around about force, but there was nothing to indicate excessive force that we could pick up at that particular stage. So their status was that of witnesses. So again, back to welfare, well-being, support of the officers was that we would provide them, and again there was quite a detailed, as I say, with Gary McEwen, with the chair, with a number of other members round about a rationale for providing this information to them, but it was simply based on their welfare and well-being.
Were you ever in a position, you've described your involvement as SIO,
Yes.
were you ever in a position to exclude the hypotheses that excessive force had been used on Mr. Bio?
Not
Or,
when no.
Or that it had been used on him because he was black?
So I think I've asked two questions there. Is that two separate
I
questions?
hadn't finished my first question, that's why I was asking. So was there ever a position when, a point at which you were involved as SIO, where you were able to exclude the possibility and the hypothesis that excessive force has been used? Let's leave that at one question.
So there was not, no.
No.
No, when I done a handover to Keith Hardy to remit, that hypothesis still remained open.
And was there ever a point in time when you were involved as SIO that you could exclude the possibility that the actions of the officers had been influenced by the fact that Mr. Bio was black?
At no time at all.
So those hypotheses could not be excluded as possibilities by you?
So the hypothesis round about the attack or the restraint happened on him because he was black was not one of the hypotheses I've already mentioned to you.
Well, why not?
Because the aspect of the information I had at the particular time did not indicate in any way that it was racially motivated.
Was that not something that you considered because you were keeping an open mind?
Absolutely. But the aspect that I had at that time round about the hypotheses that I was running with the circumstances of Mr. Bio being in the street with a knife, this was not someone provoked attack or restraint by police officers at the stage and the information I had.
But if you were keeping an open mind, you were aware that Mr. Bio was black.
Absolutely.
And you've talked last week about the fact that there are a number of inquiries down south. And we'll come on to that later today.
Yeah.
But why was it not part of your working hypotheses about excessive force being used?
So excessive force being used was a hypothesis which I've already
Yes.
described, yes.
And was it not part of any hypothesis that the reason for excessive force being used could have been because Mr. Bio was black?
There was nothing which I had in respect of information or evidence, and we have independent witnesses from the public who have called about Mr. Bio being in the street with a knife, acting erratically. The restraint came as a result of Mr. Bio's behaviour. That did not in any way, there was no relevance at all. The fact he was black in respect to that, the restraint occurred because of his activity and because of his behaviour.
But he had died at the scene, and you've said the post-mortem was unascertained.
Yes.
When I say post-mortem, I mean cause of death was unascertained. So were you closing your mind to the possibility that the fact he was black had something to do
No.
with the circumstances?
And as I've already said, that one of the hypotheses which remained open was excessive force had been used. And as I said, that was still apparent and still evident until I actually handed over the investigation.
Before I move on to other questions about this, can I ask you briefly about completion of paperwork? We've talked last week and today about statements. Can you explain the obligations on officers to complete use of spray forms in May 2015?
I genuinely can't. In my role, even back then, it's nothing I would have actually have a kind of hands-on experience of doing. I'm aware there were online forums or on electronic forms that they had to complete, but regarding how you complete them and where you submit them through to, I think it's to the Officer Safety Training Unit or whatever else it goes to. But in my role in 2015, there was nothing I really actually got involved in. Was the completion of use of spray forms. That would have been their line manager that would have basically ensured that the various processes were carried out around that, but nothing as SIO I would have been involved in.
What about use of force forms?
Similar, I mean, that's the personal responsibility of the officers or their line managers to complete.
In the absence of getting initial personal accounts or operational statements, would these forms not have provided some assistance to you as SIO?
Absolutely.
And did you consider at any stage whether you had some leverage in terms of requiring the officers to complete these forms prior to going off duty?
It was clear from my discussion with Amanda Given that they were not going to complete notebooks, forums, or provide operational statements prior to legal advice.
And so you classed the use of spray forms and the use of force forms as part of that?
Yes.
And did you consider whether any further steps could be taken by you as SIO in relation to these forms?
Not at that time, not on the 3rd or 4th of May. That was obviously something that was going to come through the subsequent investigation, but as I say, in the 3rd of May, extremely fast moving. It was clear that the advice from the Federation was not to provide any further information at this stage until seeking legal advice.
And we've heard that although that can be the advice, it is still an option for officers to give statements or to complete forms or to give information, even if the legal advice is not to do that. At any time, did you consider asking the officers individually if they would be prepared to give initial personal accounts or statements or complete any of the forms?
So that sits with the PIM, because PIP's been initiated. So again, that sits with Conrad.
And did you ask Conrad Trickett to facilitate obtaining use of spray or use of force forms?
Not in particular, but I did ask around personal initial accounts stroke operational statements, as I've discussed.
Yeah, you gave evidence about that. So was there anything done by you in relation to seeking the forms to be completed?
No, I mean, it was discussed, but the position of the officers was so clear that they were not going to be providing any statements, documentation at all. And I take your point when about, well, is there anything more we can do to almost ask or direct them that they have to do it? No, I mean, it's a really difficult one. How do you actually force someone to make a statement or give a personal initial account when their position is they're basically not doing anything at all until they seek further legal advice around this at this stage? And the Supt states that obviously officers should account for their actions and their movements whilst on any tour of duty or whilst engaged with. But again, how do you physically do that without their consent to provide that information to you? I mean, it's extremely difficult. I mean, you can ask them, you can instruct them to do it. Thereafter, if they don't, you revert back to performance regulations or misconduct or whatever else. But at that stage of a critical investigation, I mean, what more can you actually physically do?
And did you consider the possibility of using misconduct or disciplinary proceedings as some sort of lever to encourage the completion of the forms?
No, but it was in the back of my mind, because I was aware, obviously, the officers have a duty to provide information and to an SIO as such in respect of that, and I think it was the investigation of death SOP at the time. They should make you aware of the circumstances of the death, but again, standard operating procedures are there as how it should work. But again, sometimes there are occasions such as this whereby you're left with a significant incident whereby the advice and the legal advice they're getting, even before I arrive, we've got a Federation rep there, before I arrive, providing that direction, although Amanda will deny she did do that, but it was clear in my engagement and through the course of that whole day of the 3rd of May that there was it was extremely unlikely that they were going to submit anything at all. And as I say, that progressed through the third and into the fourth, and in the fourth it became, the indication was it would potentially submit after the post-mortem examination, but with the post-mortem examination being extremely vague in its findings, thereafter brought in the whole aspect of toxicology, which takes a period of time.
What could you have done if you'd wanted to raise the spectre of disciplinary or misconduct proceedings? What could you have done in your role as SIO?
So there's a number of things, but that probably sits more with their line management right about the fact that they failed to do that. So there is that whole line management aspect, starting from their sergeant to their inspector. So around about the aspect that Stevie Kay has, the role of the governance of that shift as such, of the officers involved. And regarding my own perspective of it, is that if the legal advice is not to provide anything at all, as I say, other than, I'm not unsure, I mean, what do we put down, or do you actually move towards misconduct at such an early stage on the back that the Federation advice is not to provide anything at that stage? So again, I was trying to kind of balance this through. It was extremely unusual. As I said, 27 years, I've never had the refusal of operational statements, but I'm still a bit puzzled how you force someone to give a statement. And I think that's the challenge I had.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time.
Yes, we'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.